Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are going to be doing my end of month wrap up for July. So we're going to talk about everything that I read in the last 2 weeks of July. So this was an interesting time period for me because I attempted 11 books. I only read 5 of them, which means I DNF'd 6. Which is a lot. I mean, that's a lot for a month, but I did that in the last 2 weeks. So, now because there are so many DNFs, I am going to structure this video a little bit differently. Instead of going chronologically like I normally do, I am going to break it up into the books that I read and the books that I DNF'd. Just in case you don't care about one of them, you can just skip it and watch the part that you want to watch. So we're going to start with the books that I did read, and the first one is The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. This is an adult science fiction standalone, and we are following 2 main characters. The first is Tess, and she is from the year 2022, but she's a time traveler, and she goes back frequently to the 1890s. And she is a scientist, and she's been trying to figure out if there is a way to change things in the past and have an effect on the future, and she thinks she's finally figured it out, and she is very ready to test out her theory. And then you have Beth, and she is in 1992 in LA, and she is very much into punk rock, and so she goes to a punk rock concert with her friends, and by the end of the night there is a dead body in the back of their vehicle, and they got to figure out what they're going to do with it. And both of those their stories go from there. And obviously these stories do intertwine. I already have a full-length review for this. I will leave it linked down below, but that also means that I'm not going to go super in depth. But I liked this. I really enjoyed spending time in the story that the author created. I'm not really familiar with 1890s Chicago, nor am I really familiar with the early 90s punk scene. So like, those settings didn't really call to me, and I really didn't have any kind of a connection with it, but I thought they were interesting enough. The world building that I was really into was the whole time traveling machine part, because nobody knows how it was created, which makes sense in the story. It's explained and everything. But Tess is a scientist trying to figure out parts of how it works, which I just found very fascinating. I didn't think any of the characters were all that. I felt nothing for Beth, which was unfortunate because I liked Tessa's storyline and what she was doing there, but I did not necessarily love Beth's storyline. And by the end, I was not entirely sure of the point of Beth's storyline. I wasn't entirely sure that we should have even had Beth's storyline. I think that there were some things that were I have some theories as to why it was there, but I don't think it achieved its goals successfully, is what I will say about that. But generally speaking, I do think that this is a good book. I did very much enjoy it, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. I will say that there are content warnings in this, a lot of content warnings, but I'm going to focus on mentioning that there is domestic abuse and sexual assault, and obviously murder. But there you go, 4.25 stars. And then I read Stranger Planet by Nathan Pyle, and this is the follow-up comic book to Strange Planet, and there you go. It's these alien cartoons, which a lot of people have seen before. It was a really quick and fun read. I enjoyed it. These are comics that speak to my own sense of humor, so I really just enjoyed reading it. I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then I also read Naked in Death by J.D. Robb, the first book in the In Death series, which is an adult murder mystery series. And in it, we are following our main character of Eve Dallas, and she is a homicide detective, and there's a dead body, and she has to figure out who done it, right? Like, a lot of that stuff doesn't actually matter. It's just like, there's a dead body, and now she has to figure it out. Now, this was published in 1995, and it feels like it was published in 1995. It's just really, really dated in basically everything, which is interesting because this is actually a science fiction setting, but it's definitely written with the sensibilities of somebody in the 1990s. And that does extend to the romance. This is actually categorized as romantic suspense. The romance was not really my happy place, as both of our leads are definitely like headstrong, aggressive, like stubborn, just super stubborn people, and they don't have room for a romantic partner in their life, and they're still trying to figure it out anyway. And so, like, again, it's very 1995, so our male lead very much ignores boundaries, and he's got a magical penis and everything. You know. So it's not the worst thing I've ever read, but it's also not great. I will say that it's pretty easy to skip the sex scenes if that's not your deal, and I know that later on in the series, the romance calms down, which is good. Which is why I'm going to continue, because the murder mystery itself I thought was interesting. It was enjoyable to watch. I had a good time reading it. So I ended up giving this 3 stars, and I will continue with the series. And this also has about a bajillion content warnings, partially because it's a murder mystery, partially because Eve and her love interest both have very traumatic backstories. So proceed with caution if you do decide to pick this up. And then I read Unity by Elly Bangs, and this is a science fiction standalone, an adult science fiction standalone. And we are very far into the future. There has been like climate change and a nuclear disaster and like a horrible pandemic which killed a bunch of people, all kinds of stuff. The world has been ravaged, essentially. But we are following our main character of Danae, and she is one person in a kind of collective conscience of sorts. Think the Borg, but not, it's similar, but it's not quite there. And they're not as aggressive about assimilating people. Anyway, but she has decided that she needs to get out of the underwater city that she is currently living in. So she hires a mercenary, Alexei, to escort her to Arizona. And the story goes from there. I do plan on doing a full-length review for this. I believe it's going to go up after this, though, so be on the lookout. But essentially, I liked this. I actually really enjoyed this. This is a debut novel, and most of the quibbles that I had with it are things that I would not necessarily expect a debut author to get right the first time. So honestly, awesome. But essentially, I think that the setting is really interesting. I think that we didn't spend a ton of time on it, but it's what we did do was very evocative. I thought that the collective conscience thing was a little strange, mostly because like it felt like it wanted to be hard science, but then didn't give hard science kind of explanations. Like that didn't quite work. I really liked our main character of Danae. Now I will say I did not like her at first, but by the end I definitely did. I liked Alexei. I liked Alexei's friendship with the one of his friendships with Kat, who is another character, obviously. I only had 2 issues with the characters, and one was the villain was supposed to be evil but didn't really feel evil, and like there was another character who just kind of felt like a sacrificial lamb almost. Anyway, not great. But the plot was really, really interesting. How the plot was done was really interesting. There were a few things with the plot that I think slowed it down and was not as effectively executed as I would have liked, and so it did make it a little bit boring, but everything made sense, which honestly, like, that I'm really happy about that. So I will say that the other thing that I think was done not amazingly well, it's not okay. So we have some discussion about collective conscious, and like it'll make sense if you read it, but I don't think that it like it said anything new about that. It didn't add anything new to that conversation, so I was just like eh. So when we got to the end, I was a little bit bored because it was a little bit predictable, but overall I still really, really enjoyed this story, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. And then the last book that I read is Strangelove by Anne Aguirre. Well, properly titled Strangelove, an Alien Abduction Romance by Aguirre. And so this is an adult romance, and we're following one of our main characters, Zylar, who is an alien, and in his culture, basically, like, each person kind of sponsors somebody to be their prospective nest guardian. That's the female. And they all enter this competition, and the nest guardians have to prove their worth as a nest guardian and make it through this competition. And then the prospective mate also has to choose, or also has to go through a bunch of competition, and then they can be judged worthy for each other, essentially. But this is Zylar's last chance. He doesn't get to enter the competition anymore after this, so he's a little freaked out, and just through a series of unfortunate events, he ends up on Earth where he's not supposed to be, and he accidentally kidnaps our other lead, Beryl. Beryl is an Earthling, and even though she would like to go back to Earth, she can't, and so she decides to make the best of the situation and just enter the competition and see what happens. And the story goes from there. Now, I want to be very clear. This is an abduction story, which I did not know going into it, and I would not have picked this up if I had known, because abduction romances are just, that's not a trope that I really like. But I do think that this was handled the best that it could have been for an abduction. It was a complete mistake. Zylar was very apologetic and trying to figure out what he could do to fix the situation. I mean, I really couldn't have asked for anything more. Still not my favorite, but okay, we'll deal with it. But honestly, I didn't expect to love this as much as I did. I really just, it was this very soft kind of romance. Like, both of these characters have their own, positives, and they have things that they're working through and everything, but their relationship very much centers open communication and respecting boundaries and all those things that you want to see in a healthy relationship. They did so well. It was so nice. And it was just like, and also like surprisingly a lot of sex. Like, did not expect that. I mean, not a lot. It's a lot for me, but like, it's not erotica or anything. But like, I really liked their romance. I thought it just gave me all the warm fuzzies that I was looking for. So with that, I'm going to continue on with this series, even though I wasn't even sure that I was going to want to read the whole thing. But I ended up giving this 3.75 stars. So that is the last thing that I read this month. So we're going to get into my DNFs. And the first one is All Our Yesterdays by Cristin Terrill. And this is the first book in a young adult science fiction trilogy. And essentially our main characters have to travel back in time to prevent the invention of time travel, because once it happens, the world goes to hell, basically. I DNF'd this, I think, I want to say like 35 pages in, maybe. I'm not really sure, actually, but pretty early on, because I realized very quickly two things. One, I'm going to be very picky about my YAs going forward, because it's just not my thing anymore. I still like a good YA, but again, going to be very picky. But also with time travel, for me, for time travel to work, I really have to be invested in the characters or the story before we start getting into the time travel rules and the logistics and everything, because my brain stutters on it, and like, I just don't get it. Like, I always get to a point of understanding and I think I get it, and then it just kind of slips out of my grasp. And unfortunately, we jumped into the time travel rules very quickly in this, and I just could not do it. So between those two things, I just decided this wasn't for me, and I DNF'd it. And then we have Year One by Nora Roberts, and this is, I don't know how to categorize it. It's an adult urban fantasy, maybe? It's the first in a series, and there's a pandemic, and we're following a bunch of people, and I'm not even sure what they're all doing. I don't know. I only made it 50 pages in, and this is actually a pretty hefty book. It's like 400 and some odd, like almost 425, I think. And I still don't know exactly what it was about. But I also probably would not have read this. I didn't know that it was urban fantasy. I thought it was just like general fiction, there's a pandemic kind of thing. But it's a magical pandemic, and I was just like, oh no, like, oh, this is gonna be an urban fantasy. And like just kind of what I was seeing with the beginnings of certain things and the writing style and everything, it was just like, no, this is not working for me. Again, urban fantasy is another one of the genres that I'm super picky about, and I don't really want to read Nora Roberts' urban fantasy. So I just went ahead and DNF'd it at page 50. And then I attempted Mechanique by Genevieve Valentine, and this is a young adult steampunk fantasy sort of story. And we're following this circus, and every performer in the circus is part mechanical, essentially. And I guess the people in the circus end up in one of two different factions that end up fighting with each other, I guess. I don't know. I didn't make it very far into this. I only made it 22 pages, and that's because I hated the writing style of this. It was very, very choppy. The sentences, the paragraphs, the chapters, they were all very, very choppy, and I just did not enjoy reading it, so I went ahead and DNF'd it at 22. And then I tried NPCs by Drew Hayes, and this is an adult fantasy, and essentially there's basically a tabletop group that is playing, and they accidentally kill all of their people really, really early on in their campaign. And then the book immediately switches perspectives into the inn where those players died. And we are now going to follow the NPCs as they realize what happened, that they all died, and that if their quest isn't fulfilled, the king is potentially going to unleash his wrath on them. And so they decide to fulfill the quest that the players were supposed to do. And the story goes from there. From what I understand, that whole tabletop thing, like, it's just something that happens in the beginning and maybe at the end, but doesn't really kind of happen in the middle, which makes it a fairly mundane fantasy story. Although I really just didn't get that far into it because this is another one where the writing style wasn't working for me. It was very much self-published. We've got some interesting formatting that I found didn't flow very well. It also just needed an editor pretty badly. So I ended up DNFing this one at page 22. And then I tried Old Man's War by John Scalzi, which is the first book in an adult science fiction story. And we're following our main character of John Perry. And he is 75 years old, and he has signed up for the army, which is fine because the army wants him because he has all that knowledge and experience of having lived for 75 years. And they're going to help him fix his body, no problem. And then he's going to go off and fight in the alien wars, essentially. And so we're following John as this all happens. I DNF'd this around page 102 because I like the concept of this. I like the world. I even like John, but I hated the writing. So it was very exposition heavy, even in dialogue, which, seriously, anyway, like, I'm very strongly against, like, exposition heavy dialogue. But anyway, and then also, like, the characters were a little bit hard to differentiate because they kind of spoke very similarly. So even though they had different personalities, it was hard to kind of differentiate them. And so I just wasn't enjoying reading it, so I went ahead and DNF'd it. Now, if they ever make a TV show or a movie about this, I will happily watch, but I just don't want to read the series. And so after that, I tried Dorothy Must Die by Danielle Paige. And this is a young adult fantasy, and it's the first in a quartet. And we're essentially following our main character of Amy, and she lives in a trailer park, and there's a fluke tornado that comes like straight through her mobile home park, picks up her trailer and dumps it in the land of Oz. And she's just like, what is going on? But she recognizes everything because she grew up on the Wizard of Oz stories. And it becomes very apparent very quickly that this is not the Oz from the tales. And it also becomes very quickly that that is because Dorothy is a tyrant now. And so Amy, through this book, is going to obviously be discovering just how bad it has gotten in the land of Oz. And the story goes from there. I DNF'd this at page 104, and this was another one where I like the concept. I like this dark version of Oz. I even liked Amy, more or less, like as much as I'm gonna like a teenager like her. But the writing style was very much young adult in all the ways that I don't appreciate young adult writing, so I was not enjoying reading it, so I went ahead and DNF'd it. But that is it. Those are all the books that I read, all the books that I DNF'd. I did specifically, by the way, I did specifically choose a bunch of these books because I was pretty sure that I would DNF them, because they were books that were on, like, they were books for some of my goals, and I just wanted to get them off the list, get through them. No harm, no foul, just like, you know, pull them off the list. And so I did, and I'm actually really happy with that. I'm not surprised that I DNF'd any of them. I'm always open to like, oh, this book is actually good enough for me to continue reading. That actually happened with Strangelove, although I will admit Strangelove had some typos, so I forgot to mention that before. But anyway, that is all for this video. Let me know down below what you've been reading and if you have any thoughts on what I've been reading. But that is all for this video. So if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!